Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are really getting into something significant. Historical accountability. We're focusing on just one executive action, but it's one that tackles decades, literally decades, of government secrecy.
That's right. We're talking about Executive Order 14176. It was signed January 23, 2025, and it directly addressed those classified records tied to the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
Yeah, three incredibly pivotal and frankly painful moments in American history. So our mission today is, well, to break down the legal side, the historical context of this policy. What did it actually do? Who does it affect? And maybe the biggest question, why did we need an executive order in 2025 for events from, what, the 1960s?
Exactly. And the administration, according to our sources, didn't frame this as just ticking a legal box. They called it a moral imperative.
Yeah.
The EO itself states, pretty plainly, the families and the American people deserve transparency and truth. It is in the national interest to finally release all records related to these assassinations without delay.
Without delay. Right. That phrase stands out, especially given the history here. Let's start with the JFK files, because that situation actually had a law behind it, right? A law demanding transparency that goes back decades.
It does. There's a specific legal framework here. The President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992. Let's just call it the 1992 JFK Act. It was super specific. It mandated that all government records related to the assassination be publicly disclosed in full by October 26, 2017.
Okay, 2017, but that deadline obviously came and went. So, why have a law passed by Congress if the executive branch can just ignore it?
Well, that's the key part. The 1992 JFK Act included an exception, sort of a loophole. We can call it the harm clause. It allowed the president to postpone disclosure, but only if they personally certified that keeping the information secret was necessary.
Necessary because of what?
Because of identifiable harm to military defense, intelligence operations, law enforcement, or foreign relations. And crucially, that certified harm had to outweigh the public's interest in disclosure.
Ah, okay. So that clause essentially gave agencies like the CIA and FBI a direct line to the president saying, look, releasing this could cause harm, even if it was decades-old information.
Precisely. And that's exactly what happened repeatedly. We saw initial redactions allowed back in 2017 and 2018 under the previous administration. Then President Biden issued certifications, delaying release again in 2021, 2022, and even as late as June 2023. More time granted each time.
So it wasn't just one president. We're talking multiple administrations, different parties, all agreeing to these delays based on agency appeals. It really shows you the level of maybe institutional resistance.
I think that's fair to say. It points to a real reluctance within parts of the government. And look, every time a president signs one of the certifications, they're taking ownership of that continued secrecy. That carries political weight.
And for the public, for you listening, this is why these records became such a flashpoint, right? This constant cycle of almost released but not quite under different presidents just. It feeds the conspiracy theories. If the government looks like it's hiding something about JFK, RFK, MLK Jr., people naturally start asking why.
Absolutely. It undermines trust. So the 2025 order aimed to break that cycle.
Okay, so if the JFK situation shows how hard it was to get disclosure even with the law, how did this EO manage to loop in RFK and MLK Jr.? Because as I understand it, there was no equivalent 1992-style act for them.
That's the really interesting legal jump EO 14176 makes. It explicitly acknowledges this difference. It doesn't just deal with the leftover JFK files. It brings RFK and MLK Jr. fully into scope. And the EO text itself, based on our sources, notes that for these two figures, no act of Congress directs the release of their records.
Wow. So the executive order itself is basically saying Congress didn't mandate this for RFK and MLK, but we're deciding it's necessary anyway. The policy itself determined that releasing everything for all three was, and this is the key phrase again, in the public interest.
Exactly. It's the executive branch stepping in and making that call unilaterally for RFK and MLK Jr., linking the need for truth across all three assassinations. It's quite a forceful assertion of executive authority in this area.
Especially, as you mentioned, given the history. Our sources point out that the previous administration, Trump's first term, actually held back on full JFK declassification precisely because of appeals from the CIA and FBI citing national security.
Correct. So this 2025 EO seems to signal a decision to override those long-standing agency concerns, the very concerns that had successfully delayed things for years.
Okay, so the order is signed, the political will is there. How fast did things actually happen? Let's get into the mechanics. Section 2 laid out some pretty specific actions and deadlines for the Director of National Intelligence and the Attorney General.
There were very aggressive deadlines, clearly reflecting that without delay language. For the JFK records, remember, the ones with the existing legal history, the DNI and AG had just 15 days from the signing of the order to present a full release plan to the president.
15 days? That sounds incredibly fast. To review potentially sensitive, decades-old intelligence files and plan a full release in 2 weeks.
It's remarkably quick. It suggests, perhaps, that either a lot of the groundwork had already been laid or the message was clear. This is happening, make it work. It definitely signals a major shift in priorities away from automatic deference to agency objections.
Okay, and what about the RFK and MLK Jr. files, the ones without the prior law?
For those, the EO gave a bit more time, but still tight. The DNI and AG had to review those records and present their full release plan within 45 days of the order.
Still pretty rapid for documents that presumably hadn't gone through the same level of mandated review before. And did they meet these deadlines? What were the actual results?
According to the timelines reported in our sources, yes. The final JFK files were released in March 2025. That's just over a month after the EO was signed.
Wow. Okay.
Then, the RFK files came out in stages April, May, and June of 2025. And finally, the records related to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination were released in July 2025.
So, within about 6 months of the order, the tangible outcome was achieved. Maximum disclosure across all 3 cases. That's quite something after decades of waiting.
It really is.
Now, there's a fascinating detail here, an anecdote about the signing ceremony itself that really connects the policy to the people involved. Tell us about the pen.
Right. This is quite symbolic. The sources report that the pen President Trump used to sign Executive Order 14176 was actually given to Robert F. Kennedy Jr.,
RFK's son, JFK's nephew, and at the time, also the administration's nominee for Secretary of Health and Human Services.
Exactly. Giving him the signing pen sends a very powerful message. It's not just about dusty files in an archive. It connects the action directly back to the families affected by these tragedies.
It really underlines that stated purpose, doesn't it? That the families deserve transparency and truth. It makes the whole thing feel much more personal, less bureaucratic. It bridges that gap between a policy decision today and the very real, very long-lasting impact of events from the 1960s.
It absolutely reinforces that narrative. This wasn't presented just as good governance, but as a step towards maybe some kind of national healing driven by maximum disclosure.
Okay, so zooming out, looking at the whole picture presented in our sources, what's the core tension here? What's the fundamental conflict this EO tried to resolve?
I think it boils down to that classic ongoing struggle. On one side, you have the public's desire, arguably, their right to know the full truth about hugely significant historical events, especially traumatic ones like these assassinations. Complete transparency.
But on the other side?
On the other side, you have the government agencies, particularly intelligence and law enforcement, raising legitimate concerns about potential harm to national security, even if the information is old. Harm to sources, methods, ongoing operations, foreign relationships, that sort of thing.
And AO 14176 represents the executive branch basically saying, okay, we've heard those security arguments for decades, but at this point, for these specific historical events, the public interest in transparency finally wins out.
Precisely. It was a definitive move to provide clarity, or at least the maximum possible disclosure, overcoming the previous pattern of delays based on those security certifications.
But here's something interesting you pointed out earlier, something tucked away in the order's general provisions. It says the EO doesn't actually change the underlying legal authority of agencies to classify information in the first place.
That's correct. The power to classify future information, or even potentially reclassify things under different circumstances down the line, that remains untouched by this specific order.
So that leads to a pretty provocative final thought for you, our listener.
Considering that history of agencies successfully delaying release for so long using security arguments, and the fact that their fundamental power to classify remains intact, what responsibility does this whole episode, this forced, rapid release of high-profile, decades-old files, place on those agencies now?
Yeah, should they be more proactive about transparency with historical records in the future? To avoid needing another executive order 50 years down the line to compel them? That seems to be the lingering systemic question, doesn't it?
It certainly is. It's about whether this sets a new precedent for proactive disclosure or remains an exception driven by unique circumstances. Only time will tell.